Welcome to the Empower 2021 webinar series hosted by Brewer Direct. We're thrilled to have you join us for our first in a series of 7 monthly webinars, during which we will explore nonprofit industry trends, faith-first fundraising trends in the midst of the challenging year that was 2020, what's happening in Washington, D.C. that bears influence on your work in your cities and your service areas, emerging technologies and capabilities in digital marketing, engaging your board in fundraising, rebranding, best practices, and other great topics. First, I want to introduce you to the platform. You've not only signed up to take part in our webinar today, but you've also joined a virtual community of nonprofit fundraising and marketing professionals. BDI's Empower Group is an exclusive virtual hub where you can not only take part in educational sessions via our webinar offerings, but also visit our resource center and connect with other fundraising professionals to network, share ideas, and encourage each other in chat rooms following our sessions. You'll find our webinar offerings under the Events tab on the left-hand side of your screen, and we invite you to visit the Groups tab and join the groups that look most interesting to you. This is a great venue in which to ask questions, share ideas with other fundraising professionals. You can also post articles, polls, and join the ongoing conversation on the homepage. We hope you'll enjoy it, find it helpful, and that this forum will provide a welcome networking venue for you and your colleagues. Today we're excited to welcome Jennifer Mays as our guest speaker. Jennifer is a senior analyst with Analytical Ones, one of our key research and analytics partners at BDI, responsible for research, strategy, and both high-level and deep-dive data analytics. Jen has an MBA in direct marketing, 20 years experience working on the agency side in direct marketing and in analytics, and we're thrilled to have her join us today to walk us through BDI's 2020 Rescue Missions Benchmark Analysis, which will highlight some of the exciting fundraising trends our clients experienced in 2020. As Jennifer gets started here shortly, I want to invite you to submit your questions in the chat bar along the right-hand side of your screen. We'll leave about 15 minutes for questions and answers. If your question did not make it to the top of the list, please join us for the after party. You'll want to click on the webinar group on the left-hand side of the screen where Jennifer and I will be on hand to open up the discussion for anything that you might still have questions about. Jennifer, thank you for joining us from Kansas City, Missouri. I will let you jump right into it.
Thanks, Lolly. Well, if you are like most humans on planet Earth, you are probably all too ready to close the proverbial books on 2020, maybe to never revisit it again. But the good news is 2020 was actually a very bright spot in the year for most fundraisers. And we also think it's a really good example of why it's so important to have a consistent set of metrics that you evaluate over time. For example, if a year or two from now and results don't continue on the path that we hope that they would based on 2020, people look back and might think results are diving off of a cliff. Well, in reality, if you compare those with 2020 and prior years over time, you could see that 2020 might be the anomaly if it in fact turns out to be. The purpose of the donor performance analysis, which is the name of the set of metrics that we have developed with Brewer Direct for their clients, is to do that very thing, to look at a set of metrics over time that are consistent to identify spikes or trends or certain events that may have affected data. And what I like to call the 6 metric buttons that we derive most of the data from. Some of those that are included here are the active donor file size, annual revenue trends, which are the all-important money slides that people like to focus on. We look at 5-year long-term value, and we drill down into things like gifts per active donor, revenue per active donor, and then the last one, core group, is retention and attrition rates at various levels of the donor file. Now, this is the fine print that when when most of you are downloading apps or all that, you just kind of scroll right through and never bother to think about it again until you have a question or something happens. And you can blame my first marketing research professor for me requiring you to spend a little time here, but it's really critical. She used to warn about garbage in, gospel out. And what she meant by that was you can throw whatever kind of junk into a data set, and if the report output looks like a beautiful official presentation, people will buy it with very few questions asked. However, the reality is it's garbage in, garbage out. And so we spend a lot of time on the front end to make sure that the data that we are using is very clean, what's included should be included, and often more importantly, what's excluded should be excluded. So specifically for our report, the methodology is that it is based on calendar year performance, and generally we want a 10-year file from each client. We exclude gift in kind from all reporting. It does not perform the same, generally speaking. Most of the slides that you will see will exclude anonymous and organizations, including trusts and foundations and estates, where we are able to identify them, of course. Many of the slides also will exclude giving from donors whose highest personal contribution, or HPC, as I will refer to it later, also known as SLG, single largest gift. Donors with those HPC of 10,000 or more in any year of the data that we're analyzing. And those people tend to also perform differently, hence why a lot of fundraisers have major donor programs. The one really great thing that I think Brewer does with this is to provide the benchmarking. The deck we're going to look at today is actually the benchmark deck, but individual Brewer clients will see for their individual deck, they will see their data alongside, in many cases, Brewer benchmark data. And the great thing about that is they're able to compare to their peers, see where they may be doing exceptionally well compared to them, or see areas where there might be room for improvement. And the benchmark today is based on 39 participating missions, over 1.4 million donors, almost 11 million gifts, and almost $900 million in total revenue. So it's a substantial set of data that we're using for benchmarking. And a brief stop at the definitions again. A lot of organizations define active donors differently, and some it's 0 to 24 months. For the purposes of this report, active is a donor who is given in the last 12 months. Someone who is inactive, it means that their last gift was 13 to 24 months ago, and if their last gift was over 24 months ago, they are considered lapsed. New, obviously they're new in the last year. Someone who is reactivated means that they did not give in the prior year, but they did give in the current year. Multi-year donor means that they gave last year and this year. Second year from new means they gave their first gift last year and gave again this year. And second year from inactive or lapsed, which we get a lot of questions about this one, that means that they reactivated last year and gave again this year. So many people who know me at all know a couple things about me. One is that I'm pretty highly analytical, hence me being here today. And another is that I am super, super passionate about nutrition. And so much so that I went and pursued formal training and became a certified integrated nutrition health coach. And one of the core principles of the training that we learned is that your success is really based on kind of three premises or three areas. And one is what you're subtracting, one is what you are adding, and what is what you're really doing with what you've got. And you might be wondering why in the heck I'm bringing that up. And don't worry, I'm not about to launch into a lecture about how if you cut out chips and Twinkies or eat more leafy greens, you will become a more effective fundraiser. Although I'm not going to say that you're not. But the reason I bring that up is because I'm always reminded of exactly how much it seems to parallel what we consider the three pillars to a path to fundraising growth. One of those is winning. The donors that you acquire and the donors that you reactivate. Another one of those is keeping, closing the back door, if you will, or minimizing to the extent possible attrition and those donors that are lapsing. And the third one is lifting. So in other words, what you're doing with the donors that you already have to increase their average revenue or increase their average number of gifts. And all of the metrics that we are including in these donor performance reports are based on those three pillars to provide you the insight that you might need. So let's dive in. Not surprisingly, first and foremost slide that we are going to include is total revenue. The number one thing most people want to know, especially boards or finance members, and really kind of what drives overall mission performance. Well, as you can see from this slide, which does include organizations, anonymous, and donors with their HPC of 10,000 plus, 2020 was a definite spike. Over 25% increase over the prior year. And the reasons, a lot of people ask why we may or may not include anonymous. Well, these reports are donor-centric, meaning they're based on an individual donor's activity over time. Anonymous is generally lumped into one account, and so that would be very misleading to project out across all the other individual donors. The next slide, and most of the slides going forward, will focus on individuals only, meaning we have now excluded anonymous organizations, trusts, etc. And to me, this slide is a perfect example of why we not only exclude some of those, but why it's important to know that we exclude some of those. So if you remember from the past slide, 2020 had a 25% increase over calendar 19 for all revenue combined. When you start to drill down, you'll see on this slide, the bottom box says the total income change year over year was 34.5%. That's just the difference between isolating out individuals or those that we were able to identify as individuals. However, when you further drill down and isolate out those over 10K plus people that I was talking about how they behave differently, and focus on really what's the core of the revenue and the donor file, you'll see that the increase for 2020 was actually over 40% compared to calendar 19. Even though we talk about a consistent set of metrics, that's not to say we ignore time and progress and put our heads in the sand. And one of the ways that we incorporate and try and stay on top of things is this year's report includes some metrics on online giving. This first slide is sheer revenue from online giving. And you don't worry, you didn't have to be a teacher's pet in math class or speak Mathanese to be able to see here that there's a substantial increase from calendar 19 to calendar 20. In fact, for those of you who haven't already done the math in your head, it's actually a 103% increase over calendar 19. And over 5 years, it's a 180% increase. Talking about percentage of total giving from online, well, one thing I'd like to point out, and it's noted in the little fine print there, but there were some organizations that were part of this benchmark that had very little or even no identifiable online giving. And the reason that we were a little bit concerned about that is this particular slide takes total giving and then identifies the percent of total that is from online. Well, because some organizations had no identifiable online giving, we went out and we said, let's benchmark the benchmark. And we looked into the 2020 Blackbaud Charitable Giving Report. For human services in 2020, they identified that the percentage of total fundraising from online giving was at 10.9%. Well, as you can see here, for the Brewer clients, that number was 14%. So it's a very impressive number, and it's a considerable increase over calendar 19. Now we want to drill a little bit down into income by life cycle. And if you'll remember some of those earlier slides defining what the different groups meant, multi-year is one that is the lion's share, generally speaking, of both donors and revenue. And you can see that is absolutely true here for the aggregate benchmark. 64.5% of the total revenue came from multi-year donors. And if you're wondering what those little red boxes are, if you ever play darts or tennis or anything like that, you'll know you kind of have that bullseye that you aim for. Those red boxes identify what the optimal ranges are for multi-year and new donors. And obviously, for multi-year, we are smack in the middle of it at 64.5%. We're also right in it as well for new donors at 12.4%. Next, we're going to look at similar information to that, but in addition to the percent of revenue from each life cycle, we're going to add to that the percent of the donor file from each life cycle. This is called a bidirectional chart, sometimes called a pyramid chart, because if you stacked them all up on top of each other, oftentimes they'll look like a pyramid. But here you can see our multi-year, again, 64.5% of the total revenue, and that only actually represents 41.5% of the donors. New, on the other hand, 12.4% of the total revenue on the left side in teal, and on the right side in teal, 25% of the total number of donors on the left side in blue. And by the way, I didn't explain this earlier, but originally when we were talking about the definitions, I should have pointed out that those were not mutually exclusive. In other words, someone can be active and new, or someone can be a multi-year and active, but these here are mutually exclusive. In other words, a donor can only be in one of the groups. Another way that we think it's important to look at total revenue and total number of donors is based on what they're cumulatively giving in a year. This particular chart, which by the way does include giving from HBC 10,000 plus donors, this takes their cumulative giving over the year and lumps it into categories and then shows what percent of donors and income are from those groupings. So you can see, for example, the people who gave between $100 to $1,000, they represent 37.2% of the donor file and 37% of the total revenue, almost equal parts. And one thing that we often see on a chart like this is the smallest and the largest could be the inverse of each other, and that's almost true here, where the donors that gave under 25 cumulatively represent 16.4% of the donors, but only 1% of the revenue. Conversely, those donors who gave 10,000 plus cumulatively, they are only 0.2% of the donor file, but they gave 21.4% of the total revenue. And again, that's why they perform differently. They're kind of their own little class, and that's why we exclude them from many of the slides. This next slide here is really just a visual representation of how the donor files break out. Individual brewer clients, it's kind of a handy way to see the different groups. And one thing that I would like to point out about this is all of these quantities represent the quantities of donors at the beginning of 2020, with the exception of new donors, obviously, because they became new in 2020. So now let's switch from revenue to looking a little bit more at the donor file itself. Again, similar to the total revenue, number one thing a lot of people ask is, what's the size of the total active donor file? Well, you can see very consistent patterns over the last 4 years, and then another big spike in 2020. 25% change year over year compared to calendar 19. This slide is you kind of think of it as, I think of it as a little bit like a teeter-totter. So on the left side, we are talking about the donors that are new and reactivated, and on the right side are the donors that are lapsed. You always want to make sure that the donors on the left side, the new and reactivated, are taller than the bar on the right side for the lapsing donors. Because if they're not, that means your file is not growing. And even though this is again based on aggregate data, one of the key points I think about this one to mention is that 70% of donors retained in 2020. Here's another way to look at it, and again, you don't have to speak the Mathanese to be able to identify this. So if you're looking at donor attrition, which is the number under the red triangle, that minus the total of donors that were new and reactivated is what represents your donor file growth or loss. In this case, a growth of 112,000 donors in aggregate for the brewer clients. Another way to look at donor file growth and loss is in a stacked bar format, and we try and include charts that sort of speak to different people in the way that they kind of absorb information. So this one, if you, for example, look at calendar 20, the two darker blue bars, the lighter blue or the medium blue is reactivated, the darker blue is new donors, the lighter blue at the very top are those who were retained, and the red line indicates the donors that were lost. And if that red line stays below the top of that blue bar, then you know the donor file has grown, in which case in 2020 it most definitely has. In fact, some pretty amazing stats to talk about on this one. The number of new donor, the change year over year compared to calendar 19 is almost 69%. And the number of reactivated donors, we have 40% more reactivated donors than we did for calendar 19. It's amazing. I know, I'm really nerdy when I get super excited about stuff like this. Drilling down a little bit more into new and reactivated donors, here's a chart that shows you kind of the pattern of the quantity of them over time. And there again, you see almost 69% and 40% reactivated. It's just another way of looking at the donors, but you can definitely see the spike for calendar 20. Now, looking at the average gift for those new and reactivated donors, you might look at those percent change year over year and say, well, golly gee, it's only 16% and 10%. Well, I'm here to tell you that we do not often see both counts and gift size increase within the same year, because often it's an inverse relationship or at least a flat relationship. Then again, there's very little that was typical about 2020. Another online slide that we added in this year is looking at donors acquired online compared to the percent of total new donors. And it might look to you like it's still pretty small percentages acquired from online, but you can see in calendar 19 and calendar 20, again, there were pretty significant jumps percentage-wise. It's actually 50% increases in both of those years. And again, keep in mind, some organizations didn't have identifiable online gifts, so this is pretty impressive. Now talking about retention rate trends. This is where we're talking about that whole keep of the win, keep, lift. And it's amazing. It is amazing. So I'll save my excitement till the end here, but overall retention, it's just a measly 70%. And that is actually a 9% increase over calendar 19. But let's drill down a little bit into the various life cycles and look at how multi-year donors, already in the 70%, is 81% for calendar 20. That is phenomenal. We rarely see retention rates over 80% for multi-year. In fact, industry averages hover around somewhere around in the 60s, maybe mid to high 60s. The other one that I think is terribly impressive for the aggregates is the second-year donors from new. That means the number of new donors who came on the file and actually made a second gift in the next year, 43%. Many of our clients we see in the 25 to maybe 30%. Brewer was already pretty astounding in the mid to high 30s, but 43%. It's amazing. Okay, I'll tame down my enthusiasm a little bit for. Okay, this next chart is a little tricky. It's probably the one we get the most questions about. And so I'm gonna spend just a second to kind of walk through it, even though some of these figures are aggregate and they may not mean as much to individual clients, so look, for example, at the column that is the second one down, cumulative, meaning they gave $10 to $24. What this chart is telling you is that at the start of calendar 20, there were 75,247 donors who had given between $10 and $24 cumulatively in calendar 19. Following all the way over to the right, the lighter blue bar is 54%. That means in 2020, 54% of those donors were retained. So that's how you read this chart. One of the key takeaways for this, for me anyway, is that every single value grouping improved their retention over the prior year. Every single one of them. That's another thing that we don't often see, not even for 2020 for some of our clients. Digging down a little bit more into donor giving analysis. So here we're looking at, this is where we're talking about the lift portion of our win, lift, keep. And average gift size, steadily increasing over time, took a decent jump in calendar 20. And again, you may be saying, well, geez, only 8.7%. But again, it is very unusual to see both donor counts and average gift increase in the same year. So this is impressive, trust me. Gift frequency also increased here with a 3.4% change year over year compared to calendar 19. And not only do we not see donor counts and gift size increase in the same year, we hardly ever see donor counts, gift size, and gift frequency increase in the same year. It's the trifecta. So looking at upgrading and downgrading, which we're going to talk about for a couple slides, this particular chart, which is very patriotic looking, the blue, dark blue represents the donors that have upgraded. The pale blue represent the group of donors that made no change in their giving over the year. The red indicates the donors that downgraded, and the dark gray indicates the donors that had no change in their giving. Well, you can see from the swirly chart on the right, overall upgrade percentages ended up at 43% in 2020. That's a 37% increase over calendar 19. We typically consider upgrade rates at or above 30% to be healthy. Anything over 40 is, again, very strong. And here we're at almost 43% for calendar 2020. Another one of the metrics that we're looking at for online giving is the sheer total number of gifts that we are able to identify as being online. And it's pretty easy to see here that for calendar 20, there was another gigantic leap forward. And in fact, it's actually a 91% increase. Part of the reason that we like to include that number of online gifts right before we talk about the average gift is we tend to urge caution sometimes looking at averages. Sometimes an average might not identify anybody. In other words, if you have someone who makes $10,000 and you have someone who makes $100,000, the average of that is $55,000, but really it doesn't even come close to describing either person. So you have to be careful with averages and know what's gone into that calculation. And the reason I mention that here is you can see there's a little bit of volatility. You know, it's fairly constant over the last 4 years. And then there was a pretty big jump in calendar 20 in terms of the average. And we feel a little bit more comfortable identifying that here because of the significantly higher number of gifts that we saw in the last slide. Now let's talk a little bit more about upgrading. This particular slide, the next couple slides talk about upgrading, and this particular one identifies donors' single largest gift, or HPC, if you remember that. And it's looking at those whose single largest gift, or HPC, was between $100 and $999.99 in the prior year, and then they upgraded to $1,000 or more in the current year. Well, you can see very stable over time, and a giant arrow right up to the right in 2020 again. The percent change is 54.5%. So here we're talking about lift, and this is definitely a lift. Another upgrade metric that we like to look at is cumulative giving from a donor over the course of a year. So this slide represents donors who cumulatively gave less than $1,000 in the prior year, but gave more than $1,000 in the current year. And this is actually just a measly little 81% increase over the prior year. So that arrow is headed straight off the charts. We talked about how lift can be getting a higher number of gifts from donors. Well, here we're looking at donors who give 4 or more gifts annually. And there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll walk you through it here. On the left side is the sheer number of donors who are giving 4 or more gifts annually. That is represented by the solid dark blue arrow. The right side is the percent of donor file that those 4+ gift donors represent. At the bottom, because it's a little bit confusing, we're going to go ahead and give you all the specifics of that. And something to point out, other than the fact the arrow is again headed straight up to the right, is that retention of those 4+ donors giving 4+ gifts is 73% for calendar 20. I mean, you can't hardly make these numbers up. I'm serious. So as if 4+ gifts wasn't enough, we want to look at those donors who may be monthly giving donors. And to be fair, this doesn't necessarily mean they are giving you every single month via a pledge program or some kind of sustainers program. It's any donor who's given 12+ gifts over the course of a year. And wow, what a surprise. We're seeing another arrow up to the right for 2020. And it's been impressively increasing, consistently increasing over time. But here, continuing retention of those donors giving 12 or more gifts over the course of a year, 73.8%. Not only that, if you look down in the chart at some of the metrics, the sheer number of donors that are giving 12 gifts is increasing. The gift frequency is stable or slightly increasing. The average gift is stable or increasing. And then the revenue or the retention that I talked about, almost 74%. It's all good. A lot of people always want to talk about long-term value, as well they should, because really it doesn't matter if a donor gives you a lot 1 year and they go away. Yes, we'll take that giving, but we want donors who are going to stay on the file. We want to retain or keep those donors. One of the reasons we love to talk about long-term value is that it encapsulates all the 3 pillars that we were talking about earlier: winning them, keeping them, and lifting them. And to be fair, donors might come on and off the file over the course of that time. They may give more or less over time, but the overall net value of them over time is illustrated here. So for example, the acquisition class of calendar year 16, there were 90,776 donors in the aggregate file that were acquired. In calendar year 16, the average value of those donors was $68. By the end of calendar year 2020, the average value of that group of donors collectively was $254. This next slide, it is a snapshot, if you will, into some of the more subsequent acquisition classes. So at the top, you will see the same information that we looked at a minute ago on that last slide with a little bit more detail. Then you can take a little peek at the acquisition classes of 17, 18, 19, and 20 for that matter, and kind of follow them forward for a couple years to see how they're doing so far. I love this chart. It is probably one of my favorites because while most people realize that the value of the first gift is very highly correlated to long-term value, with donors who give $100 plus generally having the highest long-term value, not as many people think about any correlation between the time to the second gift. So in most cases, we've run 39 of these, and in most cases, it's almost a direct correlation. And so it emphasizes not only the importance of that second gift, both that it happens, but also when it happens. And if any of you are single, it's kind of like my embarrassing analogy that I like to say is like that all-important second date. Not only is it important when it happens, but it's also important, or not only is it important that it happens, but it's kind of important when it happens in terms of the long-term value of that potential date. So here we're delivering on those key metrics that we promised you at the very beginning with actual data on the aggregate file. And while some of these aggregate numbers may not be as meaningful to individual brewer clients, they will see their data here and then can use this as benchmarks to compare against. And some of those that they would particularly look at is the $254 5-year long-term value per donor, the 2.46 average number of gifts per active donor, $197 in revenue per active donor, and particularly the overall 70% retention rate. Here is a year-over-year comparison with a lot of numbers. It's, sometimes charts make people's eyes glaze over because it's not a pretty graph, but there is some pretty valuable information here. It's really just a lot of the recap of earlier slides in a summary data chart format for those people whose brains work that way. Individuals of 10,000 plus are excluded. I will point that out here. And really some of the key takeaways here is that 2020 was, again, exceptional. Pretty much everything meaningful improved. If you look down the line, you can see almost all positive increases. The only quote-unquote negatives are the number of active donors. The variance is less than 0.1%. And then attrition, which is a negative 16.3%. Even though that's negative, that's actually a positive. That means we lost we lost 16.3% fewer donors than we did the prior year. And really, 41% increase in gross and a 69% increase in new donors. It's, again, amazing. I know I've said amazing a lot of times, but it's amazing. On individual brewer clients here, we'll see key takeaways on their particular data. I would say some of the key takeaways for the benchmark aggregate deck overall is that the majority of clients will be starting out 2021 in a very strong position, very strong. Retention will be a key, especially with all of those new donors and reactivated donors. It's anybody's guess at whether those will perform more like disaster donors or whether they will convert at rates anywhere similar to past history. So we've made our way through the 2020 revisit journey, and results for Brewer Direct Mission clients have been just absolutely outstanding. Analytical Ones works with a variety of other types of clients, and for the most part, we have seen considerable increases in 2020. Not always to this extent, but one thing that I would say is what we have seen are those clients who did not pull back initially when all of the 2020 chaos broke out, they performed the best, they responded the best. A lot of our clients are very event driven. Some of those people obviously suffered the most given the lack of ability to have in-person events. But again, we had some clients who kind of put their head in the sand out of fear of what might happen. And in fact, we were so convinced that there was something to the trend of 2020 in relation to the stay-at-home orders and all of the very crazy headlines of the year, that for a lot of our clients, we took the by week for 2020, we plotted revenue against some of the major news headlines. And almost without exception, the clients that we did that for, you can see that the spikes happened shortly after the stay-at-home orders were in place and generally continued to be sustained throughout the rest of the year. So we do definitely believe there was an impact that the events of 2020 had on giving. Whether or not some of those results will sustain into 2021 and ahead, well, boy, I wish I had a crystal ball, because that is a question we get a lot. We are certainly hopeful, and we certainly know that Brewer Direct's mission clients will be on very strong footing to head into that journey. And hopefully you have additional questions for me, and thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Pat, the marketing manager at BDI. And hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Hello.
Hello. I'm going to be going through some questions. I've been receiving some questions, and as we're going through them, please feel free to put in the chat whatever questions you may have for Jennifer, and we'll go through and try to address as many as we can during this time. So first question for you. Let's just start at the basics. Can you define what a disaster donor is?
Sure can. Good question. And I would say that there's really two parts to a disaster donor. In many cases, your regular donors may be giving in response to a disaster. As we saw with Brewer's clients last year, a lot of the existing donors raised their giving likely in response to what happened. But generally, when people are talking about disaster donors, they're referring to those who give in result to something like a disaster, a natural disaster such as a tsunami, or an example that is not necessarily a natural disaster, but if you remember the ice bucket challenge, a lot of those people, it's generally something that's really big in the media, in the headlines, in social media, and that's what prompts them to give, as opposed to, for example, an acquisition mailing that you may have done. And a lot of times those are called disaster-only donors because those donors are a little bit harder to retain, because once the event goes out of the headlines or the emotion wears off of whatever is happening, then they might trickle off. So that's generally what we're talking about with disaster donors.
Great. So for those disaster donors, you were mentioning that a lot of them were acquired in 2020 during COVID time. What would be your advice to get them to continue in this year and beyond? Or what's your best guess really for what's going to happen with these donors?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I really wish I had a crystal ball. I would say, based on historical data, there's probably some aspect of that disaster-only donor to them. However, COVID did a couple things. Number one, it's been in the news and all the headlines for a much longer time than most typical disasters. And I think it also really kind of exposed some things like food scarcity and some of those other issues for people who maybe weren't really thinking about some of those things on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
So we're hopeful that more of them, that they'll perform a little bit more like a regular donor and less like a disaster-only donor. One of our next studies is planned to study the actual retention and kind of some of the things that are different about those COVID donors.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, yeah, I guess we'll see.
I'll definitely see.
All right, this next question here, you spoke to a slide that addressed percent of revenue by value segment. What do you say is the right mix of donors? How much of our revenue should be coming from donors with gifts over $10,000? Or just what would you say is the right mix?
Well, I don't know if I would necessarily say there is one right mix. Kind of like what we talk about in the health coach world, there's not one right diet or eating plan for everybody. It really depends on the organization. Excuse me. So in other words, if an organization has a more robust major donor program, then they probably will see a higher percent of donors that are 10,000 plus. Whereas if other donors are focusing on smaller gifts and that's what their efforts are geared towards, then they're going to see fewer of those larger donors. In terms of donors, like percent of revenue from multi-year versus new, we had a slide about that. And generally speaking, this does also vary. And as you could see, 2020 kind of threw a curveball in that regard. But generally, we usually say 50 to 70% of revenue would come from multi-year donors. And in the 10 to 20% range would be coming from new donors. So, and then the other ones sort of fluctuate a little bit, again, depending on what kind of efforts are being done on their behalf.
Okay, so do you think that, you talk about in these results, you talk about Brewer Direct's results and Rescue Mission results. Do you think that you'll see the same type of thing for non-missions?
Well, I would say the majority of clients that we have run 2020 data, most of them saw a spike in 2020. Food banks probably were the number one in terms of just off the charts data, and it makes sense. It's, it was in the headlines for COVID. Missions were also right up there near the top, maybe not quite as high as food banks. But surprisingly, or a little bit surprisingly to us, we saw some other types of organizations like environmental and media clients also saw spikes, though not to the extent that human service related ones did. So.
Right. So, okay. So then going forward, now we're into 2021, and even though these results are from 2020, do you know if our 2021 trends are the same? And do you have any predictions for kind of how they may be going in the future?
Oh gosh, more predictions. Well, we're still, 2021 has still started out strong. It's definitely probably scaled back to a certain extent. I think many people, at least I'll speak for many people I know, and are getting, there's a little bit of weariness with COVID headlines. People are ready to get back to life as we know it, but they still are up, at least the ones that we've looked at just in the early months of 2021.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. Okay, I'm getting some more questions in here. It looks like online donors really upped their giving in 2020. You mentioned that these donors are different from direct mail donors. Great question. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean about that difference?
Sure. Well, again, kind of like what we were saying with disaster donors, there's really two parts to this. There are your regular donors who are giving online or, via digital platforms, which is not to say that direct mail is not still a significant impact. But there are those people, and then there are those people who kind of come onto your file as a result of digital media. And generally speaking, we find that those people have a higher first time or initial gift. They don't always respond in the same way to direct mail, but that again is not to say that, at least some of the tests that we've done in the past, we have found that people, even if they are online originated donors, that sending them a direct mail piece oftentimes can still boost their performance, even though they may continue to give via an online platform. So there, and again, I think it's important to know the difference, knowing how some of your regular donors are migrating towards digital platforms versus how donors who are sourced via digital platforms may behave differently.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. Okay, next question. With these 2020 results, what are the top 2 areas where you would recommend a rescue mission to increase their investment within the next year?
Oh, good question. Well, to a certain extent, I would say that depends a little bit on the mission, but overall speaking, generally, I would probably say acquisition and digital, because, just some of the trends that we're seeing. First of all, acquisition, it's important to continue to maintain the growth of your donor file. Many missions, average age of their donor file is slightly older, so you have to always be responding to attrition. But then because of some of the dramatic increases that we've seen in people giving digitally, I think, so much more in 2020 happened on screens and happened on personal devices that organizations who have a really seamless digital platform and it's easy to give online and all of that are going to be the ones who are the strongest going forward, because so many more people are, there's just not that many people. Well, I shouldn't say not that many people, but fewer people write checks these days than
Right.
in the old days. So
Especially as you're saying right now, with so many people online inside.
Exactly.
Okay, well, it looks like we have time for one last question. So if any of you guys have more questions, you can chat me directly or type them into the main chat. Let's try one more, and then if we have time, maybe we'll do another one. But can you share if all clients in this study saw the donor file growth in 2020 and an increase in retention, or were there some exceptions?
Well, gosh, there were 39 of them. I would say from memory that the vast majority, if not all of them, and again, I would have to go back and check all 39 of them, but the vast majority had increases both in donor file growth and retention. And that's why I kind of gushed a bit about some of these results, because it was, it was just one after another that saw the kind of growth that was really impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really incredible.
Yes.
Well, great. Thank you, Jennifer. For everybody that's on, we're going to be meeting with Jennifer, and some of the BDI staff is going to be transferring over to our webinar group after party that we have on this platform. It's actually on the left-hand side. If you look on the home page, there's a groups tab. And if you click on groups, it will open a menu of all of our groups, and you can join the one that says webinar chat room. Again, that's the group tab. You click on it and click join webinar chat room. Jennifer and some of the staff will be there for the next 15 minutes or so to just chat and have more one-on-one personal chat conversations. So if you have any extra time, I encourage you to go over there. And if you missed all of that, you can chat me directly, and I'll put the instructions into the chat bar here as well. So thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to kick it to Lolly for some closing remarks.
You bet.
Thank you, Jen, for presenting the benchmark analysis to us today. The numbers our clients saw during 2020 were extremely exciting. We're currently undergoing analyses on those new donors acquired during the pandemic to learn more about their long-term value to your organization. So please look forward to more on this coming up. Great questions, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Jen and I will both be in the webinar group directly at the close of the webinar. Look to the left of your screen. You'll see where to click. Click over, join us, bring up any other questions you may have, or just to spend time networking. Quick announcement. Michael Tomlinson, BDI's CEO, will sit down with John Ashman, President and CEO of Citygate Network, to address what's happening and what's coming for Faith First Ministry. Click over to the Events tab right now to register. We'll see you then. Enjoy the day.